What is up there, YouTube? This is J-Man Time, and today I have a video on some rare Ottoman weapons of the First World War, or Ottoman improvised weapons from the First World War. And this includes some improvised rifles, some cobbled together artillery, and some amalgamated weapons of both categories, including improvised howitzers and anti-aircraft weapons. Now, during the First World War, the Ottoman army was lacking a lot of extra equipment. For example, most of their rifles were kind of outdated, mostly being imported Mauser rifles that dated back to the early 1890s, and some weapons that were captured during the Balkan Wars against the countries of Bulgaria, Serbia, and Montenegro during the Balkan Wars of 1912 through 1913. As a result of this, the Ottomans were using a large number of secondary weapons, including old weapons that dated back to the 1860s and 70s. For example, the Winchester rifles that were purchased way back during the Russo-Turkish War in the 1870s. So as a result, the Ottomans had to manufacture some of their own weapons, and these included some improvised weapons and amalgamated weapons that were made from cobbled together pieces of other weapons and components from captured weapons. So let's go over some of these rare Ottoman improvised, homemade, and amalgamated weapons of the First World War. And the first weapon on that is the Ottoman Winchester Model 1866, which is a water-cooled lever-action rifle that was produced sometime in the 1880s in terms of its production. And these were rare, heavy lever-action rifles that were fitted with a water jacket. Now, one of the problems with the Winchester Model 1866 is that it can overheat if you use it for too long. And in World War I, you need as much time as possible to engage enemy soldiers, and you don't want your gun overheating in battle. And to make it even worse, a lot of these Model 1866 rifles were metallic, meaning they had large amounts of metallic components, including brass, covering this weapon, making it extremely hot if you use it too much. So as a result, the Turks came up with a water cooling system, and this was pretty much a water-cooled lever-action rifle. It was chambered for the standard .44/40 Winchester cartridge, and was still fed by the same 17-round tubular magazine, and had an effective firing range of about 100 to 300 yards. How many of these weapons were produced is largely unknown, but at least several examples do survive in some Turkish museums in Turkey. And this is one of the more obscure Winchester lever-action variants that you never really hear about, and it's one of the few weapons to be produced in Turkey at some point before World War I, and some of these were actually used in the conflict. Let's talk about some of the rare Turkish improvised artillery from the First World War. Now, during World War I, the Turks also made homemade or cobbled together artillery, which was made from artillery pieces or systems that were made from either captured components or cobbled together components of older artillery pieces that were already in use with the Turkish army before World War I. In some cases, ancient artillery pieces, as in pieces that were decades old, but were still very useful and were used to make a new weapon by fitting it with much newer components or newer improvised components, creating a Frankenstein artillery piece. And the Turks had actually made several thousand of these improvised artillery pieces, but only a small number have survived the test of time. So here are some of the ones that have been discovered in recent decades. The first gun on the list is the Kayar Kamali Top 12cm Model 1912. And this is actually an improvised medium-heavy howitzer from the Balkan Wars era. This weapon was actually developed during the First Balkan War of 1912 and was literally an Ottoman attempt at copying the German Krupp Model 1901 howitzer. The Krupp Model 1901 was an export howitzer produced by the German Krupp Arms Company for export to mostly neutral countries, but even some of Germany's enemies. For example, this weapon system was also imported to Russia, and some of these were actually captured by the Ottomans later on in World War I on the Russian front. But this gun here dates back to the Balkan Wars, and during the Balkan Wars this weapon was also used. The Krupp Model 1901 was also used in the Balkan Wars. Well, the Ottomans seem to have liked that weapon and actually attempted to make their own versions of it. And these actually appeared during the Balkan Wars and were used again during the Gallipoli campaign in 1915. Now, the barrel of the weapon is actually an old Russian Model 1877 howitzer that has been modified to fire a 120mm howitzer round. The ammunition itself was either imported from Germany or was probably homemade Turkish ammunition. Now, the 12cm or 120mm 4.7 had a range of about 6.5 kilometers or 4 miles, and each shell weighed between 15.6 and 20 kilograms or 34 to 46 pounds per projectile. So this was a pretty interesting piece of improvised artillery. Not many of these were made, maybe about 100 or so, and only a handful of them survived in some of the Turkish war museums to this modern day. And these were also used during the Gallipoli campaign in 1915, and some of these were probably used during the Mesopotamian/Iraq campaign, which was one of the biggest battlefields in the Middle East in the First World War. Another even more complicated artillery piece is the Gaza Burshiba Model 1914 95mm smoothbore howitzer system that was produced by the Ottomans in 1914 at the very start of World War I. And these were improvised or dual-purpose howitzers and anti-aircraft weapons that were built in the Ottoman territories of Gaza and Palestine region. And these were actually used during the Battle of Palestine in the First World War in 1916 and 1917. Now, the weapon system was actually a rebuilt or rebored German Krupp Model 1873 87mm or 9cm gun that has been rebored to 95mm and used a homemade or Turkish-made 95mm projectile that was a 9 by 225mm cartridge. And this was a advanced-looking weapon. It's not really advanced even by, late World War I standards, but it was a very interesting homemade dual-purpose gun overall. This weapon fired a shell that weighed about 19 kilograms or 20 pounds and had a maximum firing range of about 7.1 kilometers or 4.4 miles, making it one of the longer-ranged improvised artillery pieces to be used by the Ottomans. And several of these were actually produced and used by Ottoman forces based in the Palestine region until these guns were later captured in 1917. And these weren't the only ones produced in the region. A second version of this gun was later produced in 1916. And that brings us to the second gun on the list, the Gaza Beersheba Model 1916-17 95mm Pitard mortar. And this was another improvised artillery piece that was constructed in the Palestine region. Again, this one being a medium Pitard mortar from 1916. And again, these were made using components from the old Krupp Model 1873 field gun, with some saying that the components were also used from the Krupp Model 1867 field gun, and these were all rebored to the 95mm caliber and used homemade Turkish ammunition. The ammunition used by this weapon weighed about 8.1 kilogram or about 17 pounds and had roughly the same firing range as the previous weapon at about 6 to 7 kilometers. This weapon system was also used during the battles in the Palestine region in 1916 and 1917. Some of these were also captured by Allied forces during the occupation of that region towards the very end of World War I. And that brings me to the last gun on the list, and that is the Ottoman 8cm cannon Model C80. And this is actually an improvised anti-aircraft gun that was first unveiled at Gallipoli in 1915. And this is literally a German-made Krupp Model 1880 field artillery that has been rebuilt into an anti-aircraft gun using some components that were imported from both Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So these were 80mm anti-aircraft artillery pieces. And you will notice that the Ottomans used a lot of black powder artillery guns, and this is because the black powder ammunition was much easier to mass produce than the smokeless powder. And on top of that, the Ottomans actually still had a large number of antiquated German-made artillery pieces, German and Austro-Hungarian made artillery pieces that dated back to the 1860s, 70s, and early 1880s. Also, the Ottomans seem to have been using some of the black powder ammunition as simple anti-aircraft shells. It seems to have been easier to develop anti-aircraft shells for the black powder artillery pieces rather than the smokeless powder guns. And so there you have it. These were some of the rare homemade or improvised artillery systems and infantry weapons that were developed by the Ottomans during the First World War, and these were weapons that were mostly made out of desperation. Now keep in mind, later on, in late 1916 and early 1917, the Germans would later supply the Ottomans with more advanced infantry weapons and artillery pieces. This includes some captured Allied weapons captured from the Belgians, the French, and even the Russians. So which of these were your favorite? Please tell me in the comments section below, and until next time, this was J-Man Time.